Now, this is going to be one of those videos that is a result of being asked a question so many times that I've decided to make something that, when inevitably asked again, I can just put a link to this video and make my case that way. And that question is, of course, why does Snoke's identity or backstory matter at all, especially when you consider he was killed in The Last Jedi, and his character was clearly meant to be used as a way to propel Kylo Ren's character forward. Furthermore, usually someone asking this question will be quick to point out that the Emperor in the original trilogy was given virtually no backstory at all within the context of the original trilogy itself, and no one has ever had a problem with that. And on the surface, that last point seems like a good argument, because we really learn nothing at all about the Emperor in the original trilogy. In fact, the words or names Palpatine and Sith are never even uttered in the original trilogy. Yes, there is a deleted scene from A New Hope where Sith are mentioned, and the word also does appear in the novelization of A New Hope, or as it was called back then, just Star Wars. But never do we hear them spoken in the 3 original trilogy movies. And all we really know about the Emperor is that he's just that, the Emperor, and that he is a powerful dark side master to Darth Vader. So why does this work? Why does the original trilogy work despite not giving any backstory whatsoever for the overarching villain? And why is it a problem that Snoke doesn't get one, at least thus far, in the sequel trilogy? Well, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that the original trilogy was, obviously, the start of everything. There was no story, no knowledge or Star Wars lore for that first movie to have to worry about adhering to. It was instead the introduction, the precedent that would set the stage for all things Star Wars to come. And what the first Star Wars movie in particular did impressively well was tell a very simplistic and easy to follow story set within what was clearly a much larger overall story or conflict. And it managed to keep the focus on a few characters and on, again, an easy to follow story that revolved around a very simple premise of getting plans to the good guys so that the bad guy's superweapon could hopefully be destroyed. And never once does it let itself get too bogged down by exposition, or overburdened with a backstory that it really didn't need to make this particular story work. Instead, there are a few well-placed lines that help us infer what the bigger picture might look like. Things such as Obi-Wan telling Luke about fighting with his father in the Clone Wars, and Tarkin commenting about how the Emperor has disbanded the Galactic Senate, sweeping away the final remnants of the Old Republic. These are examples that at least give us some context to the bigger story, and help us understand just how important these smaller events that we're actually following are to the galaxy on the whole. And as the story or trilogy goes on, it never becomes important to learn who the Emperor truly is or how he came to power, because the story never veers too far from its few main characters and their personal stories or struggles. It never really gets into the nuts and bolts of just how the Galactic Civil War started and why it's being fought in the first place, though we can certainly make some good assumptions about why a rebellion has formed against what is clearly an evil empire, as demonstrated by the fact that they have no qualms about destroying an entire planet. The original trilogy also never gets into any of the history that exists between the Jedi and the Sith. In fact, the original trilogy doesn't do much what I would call direct world building at all. Again, most of the things we learn about the Star Wars galaxy itself, beyond the stories of these few characters, is just left for us to infer based off a few well-placed lines. The most we probably get is between Yoda and Luke in The Empire Strikes Back, when we learn a great deal about the Force. And it's because of all this, because the characters we're following are so enjoyable to watch even without fully understanding the greater story, that it never really becomes all that important to the story to know exactly who the Emperor is, or how he came to power, or even what the Sith truly are. So then the question obviously becomes, why does this not work in the sequel trilogy? Why must we know who Snoke is for the new story to work, when we didn't know anything about Palpatine and that was just fine for the original trilogy? Well, a lot of the blame, I guess you could say, falls squarely on the shoulders of the prequel trilogy, though the original trilogy is also to blame as well, but actually more so the prequels, I would say. And that's because the prequels were all about world building, maybe too much you could argue, because I think one of the reasons why some people don't enjoy them as much, even if they don't even realize it, is because a completely different type of storytelling formula was used for the prequels, instead of, like in the original trilogy, where everything was tightly focused on a handful of characters, and the bigger picture remained little more than a backdrop for them. The prequels brought the backdrop to the forefront, and it tended to overshadow the characters themselves. Unlike the originals, the prequels explored the politics of the galaxy, gave us history in regards to the Jedi and the Sith, introduced a prophecy, and so on. And yes, they did kind of have to do all this if they were truly going to be prequels to the originals, if they were going to set up the next part of the story, I mean. Though, perhaps they didn't have to focus on it quite as much as they did. Nevertheless, the world building of the prequels is now in place, and the lore of the Star Wars galaxy has been greatly expanded by it. And because of this, any movie that now comes out after them, especially those that will continue in general the same story like the sequels are doing, will have to fit itself into all that has been previously established. The problem is, however, that the sequels are trying to go back to that original formula that the first trilogy used, where they focus more on a small group of characters and less on the backstory. And I'm not saying I fault them for this approach, per se, because of how well it worked for the original trilogy and how many people didn't like the opposite approach of the prequels. But simply put, it can't work quite as well anymore because even a fan with the most basic of Star Wars knowledge is likely going to want to know how everything fits together. I mean, there's a reason why seemingly everyone was speculating about Rey's origin after The Force Awakens, and that's because they really wanted to know her place in the pre-established greater story, and the same of course goes for Snoke. And maybe the more entirely character-driven approach could still work if they would again include some well-placed and cleverly disguised lines about backstory and the bigger picture. One of the excuses Rian Johnson gave for not going into Snoke's backstory is he thought it'd be out of place if at one point Snoke just came out and told everyone who he is and what he wants, and I agree with him. That would have been out of place and poor storytelling. However, one quick line, maybe spoken by Snoke to Kylo Ren when he was chastising him about his failure to defeat Rey, about how he was once the most feared adversary of the Jedi until he was imprisoned by them a great many years ago, would have been enough to sate some fans who desperately wanted to know something, anything about him. Because one of the main problems here is that in Episode 1, it is established that the Sith have been thought to be extinct for 1,000 years until Darth Maul reveals himself. Furthermore, at the end of Return of the Jedi, the Sith are wiped out and the Force is brought into balance. Luke even acknowledges that for a time there was balance after this. So how does Snoke fit into any of this? Where did he come from? How could there have been balance if he existed all along? Because I think it's clear he hasn't come about just in the 30 years since the end of Return of the Jedi. After all, it's been heavily implied in many of the sources of canon that he somehow bore witness to the events aboard the second Death Star between Vader, Luke, and Palpatine, and that he has essentially been haunting Ben Solo since he was born. And if all of this is true, it means he was alive and active during the time period of the original trilogy, yet somehow had no impact on the balance of the Force. Now, why is that? And this is an important question, because thanks to the prequels, or an earlier part of this same story, the first 6 episodes of the Star Wars saga became about balancing the Force. So hence his identity or backstory is not something that can be easily ignored or overlooked if the story is to make sense. Again, this is not the same as not knowing about the Emperor within the context of just the original trilogy, which was when the story was all about and focused on just a small group of rebels trying to stop an empire, and a son trying to save his father. Because now we have well-established history. Now we know about the Jedi and the Sith, and we know about balance and basically how it works in Star Wars. And if some super-powered darkseid user suddenly shows up, and it's implied he's been around all along in some capacity, we really need to be told something about him in order for the overall story to still make sense. Because right now we're left to wonder, what is the point of the first 6 Star Wars movies? The Rebellion fought to defeat the Empire, but the Empire reformed and became the First Order, and then destroyed the New Republic, which was built out of the Rebellion. So basically, the victory of the Rebellion in the original trilogy has been completely undone. Furthermore, the Chosen One introduced in the prequels, and apparently meant to balance the Force, managed to eventually do this with the help of his son. That son, of course, being Luke, was then supposed to pass on what he had learned and rebuild the Jedi Order that the Chosen One, or Anakin, had helped destroy at one point. However, some super powerful darkseid being shows up and manages to undo everything that was accomplished by Luke and Anakin, and never are we told anything about who he is, where he came from, or even what his motives might be. And all these things are important because this mysterious figure has managed to undo everything from the previous 6 movies in regards to balancing the Force. And this is going to be a continuing and compounding problem for Star Wars going forward, being able to tell new stories off the back of everything that has come before it, because anything new does have to fall in line with pre-established lore, and to be explained to at least some extent, or what's the point of the shared universe idea at all? And the more stories you of course tell, the more lore you're going to create, and the more future storytellers are going to be limited in what stories they can now tell because of ever narrowing margins to work between. And when new powerful characters are introduced, like Snoke, again to some extent his place in all of this has to be explained, or it defeats the purpose of creating a larger story for the fans to enjoy. It also comes off as feeling like some lazy storytelling, especially when the writer of the story trolls the fans and tells them, "Your Snoke theory sucks," when his didn't even exist. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about the lack of Snoke's backstory and when we'll finally get it, because rest assured, we will get the story at some point. So will it maybe be touched upon in episode 9, or will it perhaps have to wait for a novel or some other source of canon? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.